Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a much-needed episode of Battlefield Breakdown, brought to you by Turn 'em Sideways. I am Blevins, and I am here to talk all about the big events that happened over this past weekend in both Georgia and Las Vegas. Now, full disclosure, I was at Las Vegas, cast the event with Casanova and Charmer on the Turn 'em Sideways YouTube channel, the very channel that you're watching this very video on right now. So make sure, if you haven't already, please do like and comment and subscribe, because we're bringing you a ton of content here on the Turn 'em Sideways channel. But without further ado, let's jump in and talk about those events. I'm going to go through the top 8 of both events. We're going to look at a couple of decks, and I'm going to give some overall generalized thoughts on the events and the state of the meta, because, spoiler alert, things have changed quite a bit since we saw the Chinese regional tournaments just a few, not even multiple months ago. So a lot has changed in a very short period of time as we get into the first large events here in North America. So starting off with the CCS, the Charlie's, I believe it's Charlie's Card Show tournament. It was a 10K event in Georgia. We look at the top 8 here. We've got Sett coming in first, Master Yi, Annie, Kaisa, Master Yi, and rounding out the top 8 was Annie. So to start it off, we have Annie's first top 8, second top 8, and also third top 8 in a major IRL event. This is something that has been talked about in North America, in the English scene, the Western scene, whatever you want to call it, for a while. Many people, notably Sold Out, shout out to Sold Out, have been championing Annie online, saying, hey, it's being underrated, it's not being played to its fullest potential, or not being played enough in China. And many people like myself have said, all right, let's see it. And we absolutely did in this first tournament, the CCS 10K here. Now, I want to take a look at a couple of the decks and take a look at the Sett deck and one of the Annie decks here in that CCS tournament here. Let's take a look at the Sett deck here. Now, this is a very interesting version of Sett, really honing in on Sett Kingpin and the orange Lee Sin here. Everything else looks relatively standard. We've, of course, have our Kianas, actually favoring Fiora as a 3 of over Kiana. Of course, Showstopper, Sabotage being some of the premier cards here. Challenge, Call to Glory, Hidden Blade. The Primal Strengths being a card that I think is a concession to potentially needing to go over the top in these Master Yi mid-range decks, or even potentially Dazzling Aurora decks. Well, Primal, you may not have the same unit power as a Dazzling Aurora deck or even some of those higher-end Yi decks, but Primal Strength will allow you to win a combat or two. That is for sure. Of course, when you pair that with Hidden Blade, that is another really great way to do that as well. So very strong Sett build here. A little bit different than some of the other sets we saw in the meta as well, but this one really focusing in on the Sett Kingpin. In fact, not even using Sett Brawler, which is one that we tend to see as the go-to. We've seen a little bit of both. This is certainly one flavor of Sett, and this one actually took down the entire event. Moving on, we'll take a look at the Annie deck here. And the Annie decks, for the most part, have been relatively standardized. You know, this is a deck that I personally have played quite a bit. You're seeing Pouty Poros, maybe sometimes that's a 2 of, but Traveling Merchant, Vi, Sneaky Deckhand, the 1 Annie, 3 Kaisa, 3 Darius, 3 Cleave, 3 Stack Deck, a couple of Fighter Fights, 3 Flash, Ride the Wind, Void Seeker. Those are all standard cards. You're going to pretty much see those maxed out in just about every build of Annie. And there's a couple of flex slots. I've seen decks that don't run the scrap heaps. I've become more and more of a believer in scrap heap, especially when you've got the Zon Warrens as one of your battlefields. Of course, our friend Gumbo, aka Traveling Merchant, works really well with scrap heap, but also just being able to utilize your runes to cycle through to get some of your other powerful cards is very strong there. But Annie has really become sort of the premier aggro deck, at least in this first initial wave of events here. It is lightning fast. It will catch people off guard. And not only that, it has a ton of interaction. You've got your Void Seekers, which you always have. You can very easily leave up the runes with Annie's ability to have Void Seekers interaction. Ride the Wind just being one of the strongest cards in the game. And then using Fight or Flight and Flash was really the unlock for me. It makes the Dreaming Tree 1,000 times better when you can have your units, your small units, just having material on the board is strong. And then turning your Fight or Flights or Flashes into also cantrips is extremely powerful. And then, of course, the proven combo, Ride the Wind is a combo that can end just about any game against almost any deck. So very, very strong list here. We saw, again, 3 Annies in the top 8, which, again, would be unheard of in the meta that we saw in the Chinese regional events, which was for the most part just Master Yi and Kaisa. We did see 2 Yis here and 2 Kaisas, so certainly the meta has not shifted maybe that much. It's not shifted extremely away from Master Yi or Kaisa, but it's certainly shifted more. Other decks have certainly risen up here to contest those decks. And speaking of which, let's take a look at the SCG CON Vegas 10K. Now, I'm going to list out the top 8 decks here. These I'm listing out are in order of seeding. So if you didn't watch the event, VOD is on this very channel, so make sure you check it out. But the 9 rounds of Swiss are on there. The first top 8 round got played out, and then the top 4 ended up splitting the event. Like any one of these sort of third-party events, the players have the ability to split the prizes when it gets to 8 or 9 o'clock at night on a Sunday, and people need to catch flights, etc. It's not uncommon for the top 8 or top 4 or whatever to split the prizes, and all of the players unanimously agreed to do that in the top 4. So this is the listing of the players, of the decks in seeding going into the top 8. So in the first seed, we had Annie, followed by Kaisa, followed by another Annie, followed by Sett, followed by Kaisa, Teemo, and then another couple of Kaisas. So Annie, Sett, Kaisa, Teemo, Kaisa. So again, Kaisa, not dead. The queen of the meta is still, across the 2 events, the most prevalent, but Annie, I mean, another 2 top 8 appearances here. Very strong, piloted very well by a lot of these players. And just walking around the hall and seeing players playing, saw a lot of Annie, saw a lot of Victor at top tables, saw a lot of Sett at top tables. So very much a different texture to the meta. Notably here in the SCG CON Vegas 10K top 8, 0 copies of Master Yi. So that is certainly a change, if nothing else. And I'll get into the overarching conclusions that I'm drawing here from this weekend in just a little bit. But first, let's take a look at a couple of the decks here from the top 8 of the SCG CON Vegas. This is a Kaisa deck, which you may be thinking, okay, we've seen a million Kaisa decks. Well, let me tell you, you've not seen this one. This one is from Tin Fang, which I had the pleasure of casting in one of the rounds of the event. First off, we already see something crazy here. That is 3x Seal of Rage in the deck here. It's a very interesting version of Kaisa. Of course, we're seeing Ravenbloom students only as a 2 of, which is quite uncommon. Generally, you're seeing that as a 3 of. In fact, favoring Pouty Poro as a 3 of over the 2 of here. Of Ravenbloom student. We're seeing Watchful Sentries, of course, Darius. Draven here as a 1 of in the main deck is a big one here. Acathian Rain, of course, Thousand-Tailed Watcher, and Time Warps here. But this deck, with the Seals of Rage, with the Draven, felt very different here, and we even see an additional Time Warp, unchecked power in the sideboard, Progress Day, and another version of another copy of Draven in the sideboard here. This deck, even though it's only actually a couple of cards off, felt like it played very differently here. You know, we're seeing Star Tip Peak, not one that we necessarily always see in Kai'Sa, but was very, very strong here, going for that late game, saying, hey, you know, these Kai'Sa decks can be aggressive, but in the mirror, they're not necessarily aggressive. If I'm playing against Master Yi, I need to go over the top. So having a card like Draven was actually quite genius, where you're able to capture those early points with your very good package of early units. Also, running 0 lecturing Yordle is another probably one of the biggest differences you could see in these decks. 0 lecturing Yordle, favoring, you know, a couple copies of Void Seeker, some of these other additions here. Of course, needing to find room for the Seals of Rage here, but this deck, even though it's only a couple of cards off, felt like it played very differently. It felt like it could play very differently and ended up being quite good, even favoring the 3 whole copies of Kai'Sa here. It felt like you were playing a completely different game. And again, this is a closed deck list event. So as you're playing in the Swiss rounds, your opponent is playing Kai'Sa. You go, okay, I know what I'm expecting here. Then they play a Seal of Rage. You go, I no longer know what I'm playing against here. They play a Draven, and you're like, I could be facing anything. And even though this is only a couple cards off, having those few cards off during the Swiss rounds can actually be an advantage. When your opponent is practicing for Kai'Sa, when they're practicing for that matchup in a very specific version of that deck for the matchup, really like this one in Tin Fang. Played it extremely well, at least on the match on camera that we saw. And it was very, very strong there. So definitely one to take a look at and to potentially branch off of and build from there. But the last deck that I wanted to take a look at here that also made the top 8 was someone who has been talked about on the channel quite a bit. That is, of course, Prismaticism. OG player here, one of the most successful players in the online circuit here for Riftbound so far, playing Teemo. And we see, again, a slightly different version of Teemo than we've seen in the past, than we've even seen Prismaticism play in the past. We saw originally, this was probably a month or 2 ago, we saw them top 8. I believe it was a Rift Lab event, Rift Lab trial with a Teemo deck that was really sort of churning through their deck, playing Rasa the Sunderers, and really playing almost like a tempo version of Teemo. This is certainly following up on that idea. Does not have the Rasas, has a pair of Sprite Calls, a pair of Sprite Mothers, and really a lot of the same sort of cards that you would normally see in these modern Teemo decks. Of course, Mundo being the over-the-top Thousand-Tailed Watcher, pretty much a guarantee in any Mind deck here, running on one of Retreat, and then, of course, your, you know, 2 of the best 2-drops that you can have in the entire game. You get access to in both colors here for Teemo. And of course, you've always, in break, in case of emergency, you've always got Teemo coming from your chosen champion zone to play on turn 1 if you don't have anything else to play. And it is a perfectly reasonable play to make here. But we saw a lot of what I can only describe as shenaniganry coming out of this Teemo deck. Of course, Ember Monk being the centerpiece here, setting up an Ember Monk and really defending it with a lot of different hidden cards. Now, I talked about this on the broadcast. I've talked about it on the podcast a couple of times, which, of course, is the winning point. Again, like, comment, subscribe to the channel to get access to the winning point here. I talked about this a lot. The more hidden cards that you're able to play, the better that each of them get, because it opens up the range of possible cards that can be hidden. If you're playing one hidden card in your deck and your opponent always knows it's Consult the Past, well, it's very easy to play around that. Even if they know that it's something more powerful or swingy like Tide Turner, it's like, okay, they hit a card, it's definitely Tide Turner. If I know that it's Tide Turner, I can at least plan around that. Well, if it's Tide Turner or sometimes it's Sprite Call, that changes things quite a bit, because if you're overcommitting to play around the Tide Turner and it's just a Sprite Call, all of a sudden maybe your attack is inefficient. Or if it's sometimes a Consult the Past and you exerted all these extra resources to play around a Sprite Call or a Tide Turner, and your opponent just goes, okay, that's fine, this attack happens, I'm just going to draw 2 cards. All of a sudden, even though you quote-unquote played around the other hidden cards, your opponent is now in a small way ahead. And maybe that maybe that advantage is not as overt as, oh, I just got 2-for-1 by this removal spell, but it builds up and it adds up. And with a player that is as skilled as Prismaticism and other players that we saw in these events, we're going to start seeing those small incremental advantages add up, and they're going to be winning in ways that you may not even think that are apparent. My jaw dropped at least a couple of times casting Prismaticism over the weekend, being like, I have no idea why they made this play. And then 4 turns later, it became apparent, and my mind was blown. And this is the type of thing that I've seen. I've cast Prismaticism across a couple of different games here. It's happened time and time again, and I don't know why I'm surprised every time, but I find myself being surprised. And we're going to start seeing many players making plays that are also that level of just next level is the only way I can describe it, where players know their decks, they know the matchup, they know the macro, and they know the micro of the matchup, and they're just making absolutely spectacular plays, and it's leading to results. And as we saw here, a top 8 from Prismaticism in this SCG CON Vegas 10K here. Very, very strong performance. Very, very interesting deck here. Again, to recap the top 8 across both events, we had the CCS was Sett, Master Yi, Annie, Kaisa, Master Yi, Annie. SCG CON Vegas, Annie, Kaisa, Sett, Kaisa, Teemo, Kaisa. So I want to quickly go over the top most played cards. And now this is technically from the SCG CON 10K, but it is the same cards, essentially, in different numbers across the CCS here. And it is Angie Central here. We have Cleave coming in at the top, 18 copies played in the top 8, which is the max amount. There are 6 Angie decks, 3 copies a pop, means 18. With Darius Trefarian, 17 copies. So all 6 decks were running 3, except for one that only had 2. Kaisa Survivor had 14 copies, Falling Star had 13 copies, and Hextech Ray had 12 copies. Now, those cards are also the most played in the CCS top 8, just in a couple of different numbers. I don't have those offhand, but Angie is at an all-time high right now. Of course, it's always been in the mix there, with Kaisa having their fair share of the top 8. But again, we're seeing almost no Yi here in these top 8, so we're not seeing our normal Defies or Discipline or even Ravenbloom Student. I mean, we're not seeing enough. Kaisa is not enough of the share of the top 8 to take over the other, Annie coming in and only contributing to Angie. So very, very diverse meta comparatively here, and I'm wondering if the people who are calling the sky is falling and it's just a 2-deck format, I wonder where they're at right now. Because I've not heard a lot of them saying, oh, I was wrong. It's actually a multi-deck format, and in fact, you can bring other decks and do well at these high-end events. I've not heard a lot of these people. I've not heard a lot of them chime in. Weird how they get quiet when their opinion is wrong. Anyway, let's move in here and find a couple of takeaways that I have from this one gigantic weekend, sort of the opening weekend of English release here. Not the actual release, but in terms of large-scale events here, what I would consider minor events, compared to major events. 2 big minors happening in the same weekend. Let's see what has happened here. Yi is really kind of fallen off. Again, no top 8s, no copies in the top 8 of SCG CON, a couple of top 8s at the CCS, but even just, again, this is small sample size. It's more of a feel. It's more of a vibe than actual stats here for me. But walking around the top tables of the hall on the rounds that I was not casting, a lot less Yi. Now, there certainly was Yi. I've got to say, it's not like Yi was not present. It was certainly quite present here in the event, but did not convert to the same level that we've seen in China here. And almost all of the Yi that I saw, at least, was the sort of traditional eggplant Yi, no Aurora Yi, which leads me to the next point. Is Aurora dead? We saw 0 copies of Aurora in the top 8. We already saw at the tail end of the Chinese regional events Aurora really started to fall off. I think it's just on the radar of a lot of players, so it's not like it's catching anyone off guard. People are ready for it. People are able to. The meta is already shifting to be able to deal with these longer matches, these grindy mid-range decks, these decks that are going over the top with your Dead Bloom Predators and your Eggplant Man, your Tasty Fey Folk they're happening in the non-Aurora decks. You're just casting them normally. You're playing a little bit of ramp sometimes, and you're just casting them normally. You don't need to put your eggs in the Dazzling Aurora basket, and then you're throwing away your Pit Rookies, your Poros, your Stalwart Poros. You just don't need to throw away that early game, is what people are finding. You just don't need to throw it away in order to play these decks. And, we didn't really see very much MF Aurora, and I don't think that there's really any other super viable versions of Aurora right now. And I did not really see very much Volibear at all in terms of Dazzling Aurora lists, and certainly none of them top 8'd here. So is this the death of Aurora? Are we going to start seeing Aurora play dip down? Is it maybe going to make a resurgence with Spirit Forge? Maybe there's a deck that can utilize Aurora even better. I think the question you need to ask if you're a Dazzling Aurora enjoyer is, how are you actually making progress in the early game without playing the early game units? And it's really kind of tough fundamentally in Riftbound to make forward game progress before you get Dazzling Aurora. And then what do you do if you don't draw Aurora too? Because you can't really play those small units, so you're not really able to compete on the board. Maybe you can play removal spells, but if you get to that point and you're playing removal spells, you're trading, even if you stay at parity, if you just don't have Aurora, you're just playing a worse version of the mid-range deck a lot of the time. So those are the kinds of questions you need to look into answering if you are a Dazzling Aurora enjoyer and you want to play the card moving forward. But we shall see. But the other thing here, meta has naturally diversified. We've touched on it the entirety of this video so far, but Annie came out in full force. 5 copies across both events. That is massive. Where we saw 0 copies top 8 in any of the Chinese events. So again, a meta shift, maybe just a regional shift. We've talked about it before. The different regions tend to have very different play styles. And credit where credit's due. If you're in China and you're a top player and you've had success playing Kai'Sa or success playing Yi, why would you try a different deck? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you're top 8ing with Kai'Sa, if you're George going over and you're top 8ing and winning with Kai'Sa, why would you change your deck just for the sake of doing it? I wouldn't if I was a top player. There's no incentive to. But we came here into the North American meta here, sort of unchecked. Obviously, everyone knows, or many players know about the Chinese meta, thinking what that's going to be. And a lot of players took that as an opportunity to innovate, to change, to try something new. It obviously paid off for a lot of the players here. But I think that this sort of bolsters the legitimacy of especially Annie, Sett, maybe Teemo. Teemo was already seeing a decent amount of play in China. It just was not really converting into top 8s. But we see a top player playing it, bringing a build. At the very least, I think we're solidifying some A-tier decks, if not S-tier, of Kai'Sa. Maybe Yi gets bumped down. Maybe Annie gets bumped up. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments there. Let me know what you think in the comments about the meta. Have things changed? Is it still Kai'Sa and Yi on top with everything else underneath? Has Annie, maybe Sett, moved up? Is Master Yi gone? Where's Aurora? Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and we'll definitely be talking about it on the next Battlefield Breakdown, which will happen probably after the Houston regional event, because that is our first regional qualifier here in North America. The Term Sideways crew is going to be on the premises doing, I don't know yet. I'm not going to be there, unfortunately, because I'm going to be here in Scotland. But maybe we'll do a little watch party or something there to have some fun during the regional event. We will see. Keep an eye out on all of the Term Sideways socials, which are going to be in the description below. But that is going to be it for this episode of Battlefield Breakdown. Thank you, everyone, for watching again. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. It really, really does help. Let me know what you like and think about this video. We'll see you on the next one.